There's something wrong with the doors. That's how this started for me. Not with conspiracy forums, not with late-night rabbit holes. With doors, specifically the doors inside 18th and 19th century government buildings, corridors no tourist ever visits, back hallways where no one was trying to impress anyone, 12 feet high, 15 in some cases. And I couldn't stop thinking, who needed a 15-foot door in a back office? I told myself what you tell yourself. Architectural fashion, European grandeur, ego carved into limestone. I moved on. And then I found the photographs, not etchings, not woodcuts filtered through artistic interpretation. Photographs, actual camera-captured images from the 1850s through the 1890s. Human beings standing upright at 8, 9, sometimes 10 feet tall, right beside people of ordinary height. Same lighting, same grain, same unbroken shadow lines. These images were made decades before anyone had the tools to manipulate them convincingly, and everything I thought I understood shifted. They surfaced everywhere once I knew what to look for. Cartes de visite from Paris in the 1860s, cabinet cards out of London and New York in the 1870s, tintype plates showing towering men and, occasionally, women dressed in the same formal attire as everyone else around them. No carnival banners, no sideshow billing, no showman's name stamped on the back. Just people, seated with their families, standing in front of buildings, looking directly into the lens as though their height were the least interesting thing about them. The British Museum holds several of these images. The Smithsonian references them in footnotes, then waves them off as isolated medical cases. French archives catalogue them under miscellaneous. Russian imperial records note persons of remarkable stature, serving in official ceremonial capacities. Every institution follows the same script. Acknowledge the image exists, assign it a harmless label, and close the file. No follow-up, no inquiry. No curiosity whatsoever about why so many of these photographs exist within the same 50-year window, and then stop appearing entirely. That silence is what kept me digging, because here's what nobody talks about. In photograph after photograph, these towering individuals are standing in front of massive structures, government halls, administrative complexes, courthouses, and the proportions of those buildings, the door frames, the windows, the ceiling heights, don't match ordinary human dimensions. They match the people in the pictures perfectly. We've been told these buildings were designed to project power, to overwhelm the common citizen with scale. But I started taking measurements myself, not the grand entrance foyers, those are always theatrical. I measured the interior working spaces, hallways connecting offices in St. Petersburg, 12-foot doors, no ornamentation, pure function. Municipal staircases in Buenos Aires, requiring a stride length no average person possesses comfortably. Colonial government offices in Delhi, supposedly constructed by British administrators, containing desks and chairs that would make a 6-foot man feel like he'd wandered into a room built for someone else entirely. These weren't throne rooms. They were offices, workspaces, places where people sat down, signed documents, conducted the daily machinery of governance. So I'll ask the question no one seems to want asked. Who are these spaces actually designed for? Follow that thread long enough, and you arrive at a name most historians will tell you means nothing. Tartaria. It appears on virtually every major map produced between the 1600s and early 1800s. Not as legend, not as rumour, as geography, a sprawling territory across northern and central Asia, labelled with the same matter-of-fact confidence as the Ottoman Empire or the Kingdom of France. Encyclopedias described it, atlases charted its borders, diplomatic records referenced its existence. And then, somewhere around the mid-19th century, it was gone. Not absorbed by a conquering power, not renamed after a revolution, simply removed. The maps were redrawn, the encyclopedia entries disappeared. The textbooks moved forward as though an entire civilization had never occupied the earth. But the structures it left behind didn't vanish so easily. Across Central Asia, Mongolia, deep into Russia, stone buildings of staggering precision and impossible scale still stand. Doorways built for bodies far larger than ours. Vaulted halls that seem designed to accommodate movement at a scale we'd call inhuman. And not a single verified construction record explaining who built them, or how, or why. What if the answer has been staring out of those old photographs this whole time? What if these giant individuals weren't genetic accidents, scattered randomly across the globe? What if they were a class, a functional, working segment of a civilization we've been systematically taught to forget? Guardians, overseers, administrators of infrastructure built at a scale that required their physical reality. That would explain why every photograph shows them in formal, official contexts, why they appear in roles of authority and supervision, never as merchants, never as street performers, never as curiosities, why the architectural record matches their proportions, and why both the photographs and the references to Tartaria vanish from the record at precisely the same moment in history. If you wanted to unmake a civilization in the minds of future generations, you'd start by eliminating the most undeniable proof it ever existed. You'd erase the people too large to explain away. The photographic trail isn't the only evidence that was buried. Throughout the 19th century, American newspapers treated giant skeleton discoveries the way they treated railroad openings, as straightforward, newsworthy events. The New York Times in 1885 reported a 7-foot skeleton unearthed from a burial mound in Michigan. The San Diego Union documented bones of extraordinary dimensions found during railway construction in 1895. Ohio's Middletown Signal covered the excavation of massive human remains in 1899. These weren't fringe publications chasing sensation. They were the papers of record, covering what they considered unremarkable fact. The skeletons measured 7 to 12 feet. They were found in organized graves. They were frequently accompanied by metalwork and tools suggesting sophisticated craftsmanship. And then, right around 1920, these discoveries stopped making the news. Not a gradual decline, an abrupt silence, as though a switch had been thrown. The bones that had already been recovered, most were shipped to the Smithsonian for analysis. The Smithsonian today says those collections don't exist, misplaced, lost in transfers, no documentation, hundreds of specimens vanished from the most well-funded museum system on the planet without a trace. The timeline is what haunts me. Giant photographs peak between 1850 and 1900. Skeleton discoveries cluster in the same decades. Tartaria disappears from cartographic records during the same window, and then all three threads go silent, simultaneously, as though someone pulled them underground at once. That's not coincidence, that's coordination. Why would anyone orchestrate the removal of evidence suggesting human beings once existed at a dramatically different physical scale? Unless that evidence pointed to something far more destabilizing than unusual height. Unless it suggested a recent civilization, organized, technologically capable, architecturally advanced, that the current historical narrative has no room for. Consider this. What if the giants weren't kings sitting on thrones? What if their role was structural, literally? A specialized class responsible for building and maintaining infrastructure at scales we now call impossible. Their size wasn't symbolic. It was practical. Buildings were proportioned to them because they were the ones constructing and operating within those spaces. That single idea resolves a cascade of mysteries. Why do courthouses and administrative centers feature impossibly oversized interiors, while residential neighborhoods from the same era remain human-scaled? Why do the photographs always depict these individuals in settings of governance and labor, never in domestic intimacy? Why do historical references describe them as supervisors, foremen, sentinels, but never painters or poets. And it reframes the oldest question in architectural history. How were massive stone monuments erected with such precision during centuries when our textbooks say the technology didn't exist? Perhaps they weren't built by the civilizations we credit. Perhaps they were inherited, constructed by a prior society whose laborers stood 9 feet tall and whose engineering capacity we've conveniently erased from the record. Because that's what you do when you inherit something you didn't create and can't fully explain. You claim it, you adjust the dates, you invent architects, you backfill the narrative until it feels continuous, and you remove every trace of whoever was actually here first. I found the chairs in estate auctions and museum storage rooms, not thrones, not ceremonial display pieces meant to communicate royal authority. Ordinary furniture, dining chairs, desk chairs, the kind of thing you sit in to eat breakfast or review paperwork, except the seat heights measured 30 to 36 inches off the ground, nearly double the standard 18-inch dimension calibrated for normal human legs. Backrests climbed 7-8 feet high. Armrests hovered at a level where an average person's hands would dangle in empty air. Auction houses label them decorative Victorian furniture, as though 19th century families routinely spent fortunes commissioning chairs no one in the household could physically sit in. Curators file them as oversized period design, without ever addressing why these pieces keep surfacing in government offices, courthouses, and administrative buildings where function should have mattered more than form. Then came the tools, wrenches pulled from demolition sites across Europe and North America, 4, 5, 6 feet long. Not display models, not art pieces, working tools. The grip surfaces worn smooth from use, the metal scarred with the kind of fatigue that comes from torque and pressure applied over years. Tools engineered for hands vastly larger than any modern human possesses. Museums file them under industrial equipment without explaining what industry required a 200-pound wrench operated by someone with the grip strength of 3 men working in unison. These artifacts keep appearing: estate sales, barn demolitions, building teardowns. A century and a half after they were supposedly last used, they keep surfacing, in quantities that suggest they weren't rare. They were standard, and once you hold the furniture beside the tools, beside the photographs, beside the architecture, beside the skeleton, reports beside the vanishing maps, you're no longer looking at a collection of oddities. You're looking at the remains of a world that someone dismantled very carefully. Music. What unsettles me most isn't the evidence, it's the organized indifference surrounding it. Academic journals don't argue about the giant skeletons. They behave as though the newspaper accounts never ran. Museums don't exhibit the photographs. They seal them in archive folders stamped miscellaneous. Architectural historians don't investigate the proportions. They call them stylistic choices and move to the next chapter. This pattern holds across every discipline, every country, every century of modern scholarship. Not active suppression, something quieter, a kind of practiced blindness, questions that simply never get raised, connections that never get drawn. Because drawing them leads somewhere the established story cannot follow. And when you do lay it out, the images, the bones, the buildings, the tools, the maps that were redrawn overnight, you're met with the same measured dismissal. Interesting, but not significant, as though pattern recognition is a personality flaw, as though asking why is an act of bad faith. But why is the only question that matters here. Why did human beings of extraordinary scale exist in numbers large enough to be photographed regularly and buried in formal sites across continents? Why were they documented by mainstream institutions and then quietly forgotten? Why does the built environment of an entire historical period accommodate their dimensions? Why do all of these threads converge on the same decades when a civilization called Tartaria was scrubbed from every atlas on Earth? And why does raising any of this in a university hallway end a conversation faster than anything else you could possibly say? I come back to the photographs every time. Those weren't monsters. They weren't legends painted onto cave walls by frightened ancestors. They were individuals, people with faces and names and families, people who put on their best clothes and stood before a camera the same way your great-great-grandparents did. People whose existence was so ordinary in their own time that no photographer felt the need to write an explanation on the back of the image. We made them extraordinary by pretending they never were. We made them impossible by refusing to admit they were once simply real. And in erasing them, we lost more than their story. We lost a piece of our own. Some understanding of what came before us, some knowledge of what we inherited without ever being told where it came from. The colossal doorways are still standing. The staircases built for longer legs still climb through government buildings on 5 continents. The architecture that makes no sense for people our size continues to house modern offices, modern courts, modern bureaucracies. Its original purpose buried beneath layers of renovation and selective forgetting. We pass through those spaces every day. We never look up. We never ask why the ceiling is so high, why the doors are so wide, why the steps demand just slightly more effort than they should. Because asking means accepting that history might not be the clean, linear narrative we were taught, that we may be living inside the bones of something older, something we didn't construct, something we don't fully comprehend. That the towering figures captured in fading 19th century silver prints weren't mistakes of nature, but evidence of a different arrangement, a different order, a different world entirely. Music. Who were the giants? Where did they go? And what else was taken from the record when they were removed that we still haven't been told was ever there at all?